Historians of Reddit. What is the biggest FU moment in history? A pirate known as John Leffitt had a bounty of $500 put on him by a governor. So he put a $5,000 bounty on the governor. No you. Napoleon invited his brother-in-law to speak with him before his coronation as emperor to remind the brother-in-law that he objected to Napoleon marrying Josephine because Napoleon would amount to nothing. What a slap. So when France exiles Napoleon Bonaparte, the first time, they didn't think to change out military personnel. So he basically rolls up to the first French outpost he gets to, says sup and begins reassembling an army. By the time he gets to Paris, he's got enough forces that France is like, well, welcome back. He supposedly said to the first soldiers he encountered, any of you who dare oppose the emperor, fire. The soldiers cheered and joined him. Guess who's back? Back again. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a rich man owning his company that built tractors. He talked to Ferrari about the imperfections of his car and how to improve them, and they basically laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sport cars. So he decided to start making luxury sport cars to compete with Ferrari, and thus, the rivalry was born. So I'd say the middle finger of this guy to Ferrari was pretty noticeable. Every time I read this story I wish Lamborghini had its own F1 team to beat Ferrari, since that was Enzo's true pride and joy. When Ford was about to buy Ferrari and noticed something in the paperwork that said Ford would not own the Ferrari race team. They were upset about this, and Enzo basically said Ford was too low to own such a great team. Later on, Ford recruits Shelby Carroll and beats Ferrari at Le Mans, and has every single time since they've entered a car. I would say the moment that Rollo swore allegiance to the French king. The bishop's presence suggested that Rollo kiss the king's foot as a sign of submission. It was probably an idea intended to humiliate Rollo, and was not taken very well. After some discussion, it was agreed that one of Rollo's men would do it. However, the person chosen lifted the king's foot and, without bending down, brought it up to his mouth. Not surprisingly, the king fell over, amid general laughter in the court. Following this amusing scene, the king and his men swore to honor the concession to Rollo. That's great. Just effing flip the king over instead. That whole image just made me laugh. That's ballsy. In the 1970s, the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia, asked for state funding to replace a bridge in Town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding they needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town in WV asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War isn't a big middle finger to the state government, then I don't know what is. If you aren't gonna give us funding, Soviet. In AD 37, the new Roman Emperor Gaius, better known by the nickname Caligula, built a bridge across the sea. It stretched 3 miles across the deep blue waters of the Bay of Naples at ancient Rome's most fashionable seaside resort of Baiae. But Caligula's was no ordinary bridge. It was a temporary, floating structure built on wooden pontoons. A costly and impressive feat of engineering. It served a single purpose before being dismantled. On a day of boiling heat watched by crowds of spectators, Caligula rode across the bridge. His armor glinted in the sunlight. For the 24-year-old emperor had dressed himself in the golden breastplate of the legendary Greek hero Alexander the Great. On the following day, Caligula made the journey in reverse, this time riding in a chariot, followed by soldiers of his personal guard. It was a pointless piece of showmanship, lost on the majority of the crowd, several of whom fell drunkenly to their deaths in the sea after 2 days partying. One historian claimed Caligula pulled the stunt to disprove a prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. When Otto von Bismarck was about 50, he was walking down a street when a man ran up to him and shot him 5 times. Otto then turned around and began to beat the absolute shit out of him until some armed guards come to help him. When they inspected Otto for wounds, they found that all 5 hit, but they all either just grazed him or bounced off his ribs. Literally the Iron Chancellor. On the crowning of King Henry VII, He backdated his own reign to before the date of the Battle of Bosworth, meaning anyone who was loyal to him now but had shown any sign of opposition at Bosworth was now a traitor and an enemy to the realm. Justice served. This is already one of my favorite threads in Reddit history. Galvarino, Chilean warrior who had both his hands cut off by the conquistadors for raising arms against the Spanish. Instead of letting himself serve as a message of helplessness in the face of the invaders, the crazy bastard strapped swords to his stumps and went on the warpath. So this guy was ancient Chilean Wolverine? May I add that when he got defeated again, the Spanish were impressed and offered him to surrender. But he spit in the commander's face, so they literally fed him to their dogs. The first cell phone. The first call ever made from a cell phone was to a competitor's landline. Big D energy. This is more petty. But when Taft bragged to his friends via Telegram about scaling a mountain on horseback, that it was a few thousand feet, clear weather, all in all not too difficult, his friend replied, "How is horse?" Taft was a chunky boy. It makes me so very happy to know that ball busting between friends is an age-old tradition. Even better that it involved a president. When Germanic tribes invaded Britain after the Romans left, they named the native Celts Wellisk, meaning foreigner, even though they themselves were the foreigners. That later became the word Welsh, which the English promptly adopted for phrases like Welsh on a bet. TLDR, all of history has been one giant etymological middle finger to the Welsh. Yeah, but the Welsh language is itself a middle finger to English speakers. In the late 1980s, Nintendo and Sony developed a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Nintendo then pulled out of the partnership and opted to work with Philips instead and released the CDI. This move was highly frowned upon because Nintendo had decided to ditch a fellow Japanese company over a foreign one. So Sony picked up the pieces of the project and tried to partner with Sega. The board of directors turned the idea down, saying that's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this? At the end, Sony released a game system by the name of PlayStation in 1994 to compete with the Nintendo 64 and outsold their former partners nearly 3-1, plus it marked the first time that Nintendo wasn't top dog since they released the NES. My personal favorite, the beginning of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In England. 1066. England's been invaded by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and Tostig Godwinson, exiled English earl and estranged brother to the English king. They've already fought one battle. They've captured York. Things are looking good for them. They're chilling, enjoying their success, waiting at Stamford Bridge for the hostages they demanded. It's a hot day. They're not expecting any trouble. But wait, an English army shows up. That's practically impossible. The Battle of Fulford Gate had taken place only 5 days ago, and the Norwegians had completely routed the forces of the Northern Earls. The rest of the English army was known to be in the south, awaiting a Norman invasion. Turns out the English had ridden all the way up north in 4 days. The Norwegians were, understandably, a bit unhappy. They form into a circle. They don't have their armor with the bits at the ships. It's too hot to be hanging around in mail. They've got helmets and shields and weaponry. And that's it. The English send a rider to negotiate. He tells Tostig that his brother the king is willing to offer him his earldom back and part of the rule of England if he gives up now. Tostig asks what his buddy Harald Hardrada gets for his trouble. 6 feet of English ground. Or as much more as he needs. Being taller than other men. Tostig says they're done here. The rider rides away. Harald Hardrada asks who that dude was, because if it had been him talking, he'd have just killed the bastard there. Tostig says, "Oh, that's my brother. That's Harald Godwinson, the king." Harald Godwinson rode up to an enemy army personally and told the King of Norway, known to be a great warrior and general, that all he'd get from this invasion was a grave. Battle commences. Norwegians lose. Tostig and Harald Hardrada both die. Huge bloody mess. English army is crippled. And then 3 days later the Normans land in the south. Harald is fed. He still marches his army back, gathers as much force as he can, and engages 3 weeks later. He's killed at Hastings. Normans conquer England. Basically a very personal FU moment that snowballed quite intensely. The second defenestration of Prague. The Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia sent representatives to the Protestant city of Prague telling them to convert to Catholicism. The representatives get thrown out a window and allegedly landed in a pile of manure. This was the first instance of a bounce check. No. The construction and use of the War Wolf. Supposedly the largest trebuchet ever built. When it was disassembled it would fill up 30 wagons. So anyways, King Edward I built this to siege a Scottish castle. But before it was even built the Scottish people tried to surrender. To which Edward responded with a prompt no. In actuality he responded with you do not deserve any grace, but must surrender to my will. In other words, I built this trebuchet over 40 days and I am most definitely going to use it, and proceeded to use the trebuchet anyways. I went to all the trouble to build this tank trebuchet and now you bet your AMR test it. On the 30th of September 1938, a treaty called Munich Agreement was signed, causing Germany's annexation of Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia, where many German people lived. It was signed by leaders of UK, France, Italy and Germany. UK and France signed it because Hitler promised that he won't go to war if he got the Sudetenland. We all know how that turned out. But that's not all. The biggest FU to Czechoslovakia was that they weren't invited to the meeting. Yes, they weren't invited to the meeting about their own region. Also France was an ally of Czechoslovakia at the time. So yeah. Thanks for support France. Sorry for any mistakes. English is not my first language. Also, my first Reddit post. Olga of Kiev. When her husband died, the country that killed him assumed they'd just take over and force her into marriage. She straight up killed the dignitaries that were sent to tell her she had to marry multiple times, in the most intense way possible. She then traveled to where her husband had been killed and basically burned the place to the ground again, in the most hardcore, amazing way. They made her a freaking saint. Worth a read on Wikipedia. She didn't burn the town by herself. She instead had 3 pigeons do it. And these pigeons were first sent by her enemies as some sort of peace offering requested by her. She basically tricked them into burning their own city to the ground. Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them. 1 of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send a very fast working one to Moscow and I certainly won't have to send another. Tito to Joseph Stalin. If someone made a black comedy TV series about the Eastern Bloc, this would be one of the highlights. Julius Caesar's death. At least he died surrounded by friends. The first recorded incident of a group project where most of the group doesn't do the effing work. Not the biggest, but definitely one to note. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle ordered all US troops out of France, as he said the country was leaving NATO. LBJ's first words were to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. Ask him about the cemeteries. Dean. When Dean Rusk mentioned whether or not the 60,000 plus US soldiers buried in France were to be removed, de Gaulle simply stood up and left the room, embarrassed. The Battle of Alicia. Julius Caesar's attacking some Gauls in modern day France, and they go hide in a castle on top of a hill. Caesar's army isn't big enough to take them all at once, and the Gauls have reinforcements coming, so a siege is impossible. So Caesar just builds a bigger castle around the one he's attacking. He literally just built 2 walls back to back in a ring around the castle. The first Gaul army was already too small to defeat Caesar, and his fortifications only gave him a greater advantage. The reinforcements were also unable to defeat Caesar's army now that he was behind several layers of spike pits and both earthen and wooden walls. Plus the Gauls inside had no way to communicate with the reinforcements outside, so they couldn't coordinate attacks. Both Gallic armies were defeated as they attacked Caesar's newly built fortifications, and Caesar emerged victorious. It's probably my favorite battle of all time. Genghis Khan to Shah al-Din. After the Khwarezmids plundered one of Genghis Khan's caravans, killed his people, and took his He thought to take the diplomatic approach and send 2 envoys and an interpreter. Shah al-Din decided to be a dumbass about it. He shaved the heads of the envoys to shame them and sent them back with the head of the interpreter. Mr. Khan was kinda pissed. So he marched 200,000 of his boys and effing annihilated their town with only 1 stroke 4 of that number even able to fight back. He was so pissed at the Shah that he had the rivers keeping the surrounding villages alive fully diverted, so that he would literally wipe al-Din's birthplace off the map and make it so that it was like he never existed. No one would settle there or live there ever again. No one would be there to remember his enemy who had disrespected him. Not even the dogs or cats would be spared, said Genghis Khan.